Hi class, today's lesson will be chapter 2, problem 2.10. If you'll bear with me just a minute, I'm going to share my screen with you. What I've done is I've created an Excel spreadsheet of Cornerstone Exercise 2.10 for you. But before we do this exercise, we probably need to review some terms that you should be working on in this chapter and become familiar with. So let's look at the term that we call direct materials. Direct materials are the materials that you're going to place into a product, and so it's going to be traced to a product that has high cost associated with it, or what we refer to as a significant cost or a materials cost. We're going to be looking at exercise 210, and in it they're going to give us the cost of our direct materials. And again, direct materials will become an integral part of the product or the service, depending on what kind of business that you're using. In this case, we're going to be a frozen food business, and we're going to produce pizzas. So our product's going to be pizzas. And so the materials that have a high cost that are going into the production of this pizza are going to be the amount of $120,000. Direct labor is also another term that you need to become familiar with. Direct labor is labor that we can actually trace to our product, which will be pizza in this case. And the direct labor would be the folks that are actually preparing the pizzas. And so the direct labor usually has a high cost associated with it too, and it can be traced directly to the product itself. Overhead costs are all the other production costs that are other than direct materials and direct labor. Usually they're the cost that the factory has, or in this case, the frozen food company is going to be incurring. But they're all product costs other than direct materials and direct labor. So things like indirect materials, indirect labor, the supplies that they might need to use in a frozen foods company would be examples of overhead. Another term that you need to become familiar with in this chapter is what we refer to as prime cost. And prime cost are the sum of direct materials and direct labor. So we're going to have to figure out what the direct materials cost is and what the direct labor cost is, and then we'll add the two together to get the total cost of prime cost, or what we call prime cost. They again are the sum of the direct materials and the direct labor. Conversion costs are the sum of direct labor and overhead. And so conversion cost is going to be an important term that you really need to remember, because we're going to be using it a lot in upcoming chapters. But it's going to be the sum of our direct labor and our overhead. In other words, we are converting our materials to a finished product, and we're going to have some labor that's involved in converting those materials. And then the overhead would also be involved in converting our materials to a finished product. So conversion costs are the sum of the direct labor and the overhead. Another term you need to become familiar with in this chapter is what we refer to as variable overhead. And variable overhead are the production cost other than direct materials and direct labor that are going to vary with the number of units produced. Examples are indirect materials or indirect labor. So variable overhead, you really need to remember some of this, and some of this you should have learned in Principles of Financial Accounting 121 or Managerial Accounting that you've already had. But variable costs in total are going to vary with the number of units produced. So the more pizzas that we produce, the more direct materials we're going to need and the more direct labor we're going to need. So the total variable cost will change with the level of production. But the variable cost per unit will remain constant no matter how many units are produced. Our fixed overhead are the production cost other than direct materials and direct labor that will not vary with the number of units produced. And so fixed overhead could be certain types of fixed depreciation expense on our equipment that we're using in the frozen foods company. This would be an example of a fixed overhead. Fixed overhead could also be insurance cost for a company. And if the frozen food production building is being rented, the company's renting the space to produce their pizzas, then that rent would be a fixed type of overhead. So there's lots of different types of fixed overhead, but you need to be familiar with the definition of fixed overhead. And what you need to know about fixed overhead is that the fixed overhead cost in total will not vary with the number of units produced. However, if you're calculating the fixed overhead cost per unit, it will change depending on the number of units that you produce. Fixed overhead cost per unit can go up or down depending on the number of units produced. So in this exercise that I've copied from Cengage, Cornerstone Exercise 2.10, we're going to be looking at product cost. And product cost are your direct materials, your direct labor, and your overhead. And this company is going to be a frozen foods company, and they're going to produce frozen pizzas. And in the next year, it says this company is going to produce 50,000 units. And that 50,000 units caused the following cost. Now, what I did is I wrote down the total units produced here at 50,000. But these items here are actual cost. So your direct materials cost for producing 50,000 units is 120,000. This is a given amount to you from your exercise 210. So is the direct labor, it's given to you. The variable overhead is also given to you at 25,000. Notice they've broken down their total overhead into variable and fixed components. The variable overhead would match the definition of variable overhead that we talked about earlier, which are all the production costs other than materials and labor that are going to vary with the number of units produced. And then we have our fixed overhead, which is going to be 220,000. But I do think it's important to know that variable overhead and fixed overhead make up the total overhead for this company. In the requirements, what they want you to do is round your answers to the nearest cent. And they're going to give you some different situations for the requirements. And so I'm going to try to get this all on the screen where you can see it, most of it as we're going. First of all, they want you to calculate the prime cost per unit. And you'll remember that to calculate prime cost, we're going to need to know what the total direct materials cost is and the direct labor cost. If we're looking at the prime cost per unit, then we're going to take the total prime cost and divide it by the number of units produced. So total prime cost divided by the number of units produced will give you what we refer to as the prime cost per unit. And so what we do first of all is we're going to take the direct materials and the direct labor, we're going to add those two together, and then we're going to divide by the 50,000 units produced. This will give us the prime cost per unit, which is $3.60. They also ask you to calculate the conversion cost per unit. To calculate conversion cost per unit, you need to know what the total conversion cost is. And again, the conversion cost was explained in the terms earlier. So if you want to scroll back up there, you can, but I've also got it written here for you. Your direct labor plus your total overhead is going to be your total conversion cost. So my direct labor of 60,000 plus 25,000 plus 220,000 is my total conversion cost. I'm going to take that total conversion cost and I'm going to divide it by the number of units produced, which is 50,000, and that will give you your conversion cost per unit. So first you need to find your total conversion cost, which are your direct labor plus your total factory overhead, which would consist of variable factory overhead and fixed factory overhead. So 60,000 plus 25,000 plus 220,000 is how they come up with the total overhead cost. Now we're going to divide that total overhead cost by 50,000 units in this case. And so that's how they get $6.10, which would be your conversion cost per unit. On the next requirement, they're asking you to determine the total variable cost per unit. And what you have to know here is that your variable cost are your materials, your direct labor, and your variable factory overhead. All three of these are variable cost. So to find the total variable cost, you would add the three of those together. So my direct materials cost plus the direct labor cost plus the variable factory overhead would give us our total variable cost. To find the variable cost per unit, we would take 205,000 and divide it by 50,000 units that were produced, and that will give you the variable cost per unit. The variable cost per unit will remain constant no matter how many units are produced. It stays the same. So $4.10 is the variable cost per unit, whether you manufacture 50,000 units or whether you manufacture 55,000 units, because the variable cost will increase with the production level. The next thing that they want you to calculate is the total product cost, or the total manufacturing cost per unit. There's a lot of different ways you could come up with that, but I'm just going to show you one in this case In just a few minutes, I'll show you some different ways to come up with it. But what you're going to do is you're going to combine all your costs together. Your costs were your direct materials cost, your direct labor cost, your variable overhead cost, and your fixed overhead cost. That will give you the total manufacturing cost. And all of those costs were given to you up here. It's the sum total of your direct materials cost of $120,000 plus direct labor cost plus variable factory overhead cost plus fixed overhead cost. All those added together is $425,000. And so to find the total manufacturing cost per unit, we would take the $425,000 and divide it by the number of units produced, which again was given to you at 50,000. So this is the total manufacturing cost per unit. Now in cost accounting, they love to give you these what if analysis here. And so we're going to look at what would happen if the number of units increased to 55,000. So we're going from 50,000 units produced to 55,000 units produced. And they are telling you here that all of the variable costs are going to stay the same. The unit, let me emphasize that says unit there, variable cost. The total variable cost will change because you're producing more units, but the per unit variable cost will remain constant no matter what the level of units are produced. They want you to analyze what the impact of the changes on the number of units that we produced how it will affect the direct materials. And so first of all, they want you to look at direct materials. So they're saying, what if instead of producing 50,000 units, we're going to produce 55,000 units. First of all, you probably need to find an increase in the percentage. Notice that the number of units increased to 55,000 over the original, which was 50,000 units that were originally produced. So they're wanting to determine what would increase as far as costs are concerned if we had an increase in our production level. Well, direct materials is a variable cost, and variable cost will increase with the level of production. So when we increase to 55,000 units, we have an overall increase of 5,000 units. It will make our total variable cost go up. What you need to know about cost behavior is that variable cost per unit will not change. But in this case, what we're seeing here is that the total cost of direct materials will increase by 10%. And there's several different ways you could come up with that. You could take the difference between 50,000 units and 55,000 units, which will give you 5,000 units. You had an increase of 5,000 units. If you divide that 5,000 by 50,000, it will give you a 10% increase. Or you could take the increased amount of units, which is 55,000, and divide it by the 50,000 units that it originally was, and it'll show you that you'll have an increase of 1.10, which if you converted that to a percent, is 110%. So what we're really saying is that the total direct materials cost will increase by 10%. An easy way to determine what the new total direct materials cost is would be to multiply 110% by the original cost of the materials, which is 120,000. So to get 132,000, I took the original cost of the direct materials and I multiplied it by 110%. That will give me 132,000. So our direct materials increased, the cost increased by 10%. Because direct labor is also a variable cost, it too will increase by the level of units that we increased. So the increase in the percentage again is going to be 10%. The way you can find that 10%, this is one way, is to take the difference between what it was originally, which was 50,000 units produced. If you'll subtract that from the 55,000 units, it'll give you 5,000. If you divide 5,000 by 50,000, it'll give you 10%. The total direct labor is going to increase by 10% too. So the total percentage of increase for your direct labor will be 110%. And I forgot to put that in there for you, so I'll just stick it in right there so you can see it. It's the same as it was earlier. Now to find the direct labor, how much 55,000 units produced would cost you in direct labor, we'll take that 110% and multiply it by the direct labor cost, which was originally 60,000. So if you produce 5,000 more units, it's going to cause your direct labor to go up by $6,000 to $66,000. So again, I multiplied my direct labor cost before we had the increase by the amount of increase to get $66,000. In part C, they want to know what would happen to the variable overhead cost. And again, because all of these are variable cost, they're all going to increase by the same amount. So again, this is going to be 110%. And you can take 10% and add 100% to it to get that 100%, 110%. There's lots of different ways to do the same kind of thing. It doesn't matter to me how you calculate it as long as you get the right answer. So if you find a different way of doing it, then that's just fine as long as you come up with the same thing. There's several different ways you can do these, in other words. But to find what the total variable overhead increased by, you would take 110% and multiply that by the original cost of the total variable overhead. And that will give you 27,500. Now, when they're asking you what would happen to the total fixed overhead, the total fixed overhead will not change because fixed costs remain constant in total. So there's no change in the total fixed factory overhead. It remains constant. So the total fixed factory overhead is still going to be $220,000. It's the same as it would have been for 50,000 units. And that's the same amount that they had from up above. I just copied it down here. Now, we can prove these items, or in part E, what they're asking you for is the unit prime cost. And first of all, you need to know how to calculate the unit prime cost, which was your direct materials and your direct labor. The unit cost will not change because the variable cost will remain constant. The variable cost per unit, not the variable cost in total, but the variable cost in unit will remain constant. So since the prime cost is made up of variable costs, direct materials and direct labor are both variable costs, it's going to stay the same. It's not going to change. The prime cost per unit will not change, but the total prime cost will change, but the prime cost per unit will not change. And then you can prove that. And to prove it, what I did is I put down the direct materials cost at 55,000 units. I just copied it in here. I added the direct labor. I just copied it in here. And then the two of these together are the total prime cost. Notice the total prime cost does change, but the prime cost per unit will not change. It matches what the prime cost per unit was when we calculated it at 50,000 units produced. You see, that's the same as this is. In part F, they wanted you to look at what would happen to the unit conversion cost if they had an increase in 55,000 units. The unit conversion cost is made up of direct labor, and the unit conversion cost is going to overall decrease, but this is why. The direct labor cost per unit is going to remain constant. Remember, the variable cost per unit for your direct labor and your variable cost per unit for your variable overhead will stay the same. The variable cost per unit will remain constant no matter what the level of units are that we produce. But what happens here is the fixed overhead cost per unit, which would become a part of this conversion cost, will decrease. So therefore, the total amount of the unit conversion cost will decrease. And so I've tried to further explain that to you, because sometimes that's a hard concept just to grasp, is I've taken each one of the items separately. Remember, when you're calculating conversion costs, they consist of direct labor. And the direct labor is based on 55,000 units, which was $66,000. Or it's this that I copied in here. It's the same as what we had up above. Your variable overhead for 55,000 units is going to be 27,500. Again, I just copied and pasted that in here. But because your conversion cost also has fixed overhead involved in it, you need to remember that the conversion cost that was fixed did not change with the number of units produced. It stayed the same as the 50,000 units produced. So if you were to add all three of these together, the total conversion cost for 55,000 units increased to 313,500. So there was a total increase in the total amount of the conversion cost. But if we break that down into the conversion cost per unit, notice that we would take this 313,500 and divide it by 55,000 units, and that will give us $5.70, which is the conversion cost at 55,000 units. Now, if we look back at the conversion cost for 50,000 units, that's what we calculated earlier. You'll remember our conversion cost per unit at 50,000 units was $6.10. That's where I'm getting this. Then there's a difference between 50,000 units produced and 55,000 units produced. That difference is 40 cents per unit. Or you could look at it as a percentage, and the difference as a percentage is going to be 6.5%, which is going to be less than the 10% increase that we had earlier. And again, to get the 6.5%, I've shown you out here how we got that. You would take what's in B57, which is the difference of 40 cents, and divide it by the conversion cost at 50,000 units. That's the base year, and that will give you the percentage increase. So 6.5% or 6.6%, if you rounded that off, is less than 10%. Now, the last part of this, they're asking you, what would the product cost be in this case? And so I've done a lot of calculations for you. There's a lot of different ways you can look at this. As long as you understand how to calculate one of the ways, I think it's fine, but it's also good to be able to break it down into its different parts. So first of all, when we're talking about product cost, we're talking about the direct materials cost plus the direct labor plus all of the factory overhead. The direct materials cost at 55,000 units was 132,000. Again, I just brought that down from what we calculated previously. Your direct labor cost is still 66,000 if you're producing 55,000 units. Your variable cost, variable overhead cost, you got to find that. Your variable overhead cost is right here at 27,500 units. And then the fixed overhead stayed the same. That's where I'm getting these amounts here. So to find the total cost, the total manufacturing cost of 55,000 units, it would end up being all of these added together. So your materials, your labor, and all of your overhead combined, added together, the total cost of those 55,000 units is 445,500. If you're looking for the cost per unit, the total manufacturing cost per unit of 55,000 units would be 445,500 divided by 55,000 units. That will give you $8.10. You could do this by dollar amounts, or you could also look at it by cost per unit. And so basically what I did here is I took each one of my variable costs and I divided it by 55,000 to get my cost per unit. So each one of these would be divided by its cost. So in other words, 132,000 divided by 55,000 would give you $2.40. That's your direct materials cost per unit. 66,000, which is your total direct labor cost divided by 55,000 units, will give you $1.20. That's your direct labor cost per unit. 27,500 divided by 55,000 units would give you a cost per unit of 50 cents. The total fixed overhead cost was 220,000. If you produce 55,000 units, the cost per unit will be $4. if you combine all of these unit costs together, the total unit cost is $8.10. If you wanted to find the prime cost per unit, remember prime cost are your direct materials and your direct labor. So you could just simply add the cost per unit of your direct materials, which was $2.40, plus your direct labor of $1.20 together, and that will give you the prime cost per unit. If you wanted to look at calculating your conversion cost per unit, you need to remember that conversion costs start with your direct labor cost per unit, which was $1.20, and you're going to add to it your variable overhead cost per unit and your fixed overhead cost per unit, and all of those together will give you $5.70 as your conversion cost per unit. So you need to know a little bit about cost behavior when you are working some of the problems in this particular chapter. So go back and review your terms for this chapter. Make sure you have added to those terms these new terms here. Some of them we talked about the other day, but this was just a review for you, so you'd have them all here on this example of what I've done here. So I'm going to stop here today. I hope that you can see what we've done here. And again, I'll be posting this video to your chapter 2 videos, and I'll also post the Excel spreadsheet that goes with it. So I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.